There is something mysterious and irresistible about places where the vastness of nature is the only company. Isolation, so feared by many, can be seen by others as a chance to reunite with oneself, where the noise of cities is replaced by the sound of the wind and the sea. But what really makes a person choose to live far from everything and everyone? There's a certain romantic appeal to this idea of cutting ties with modern chaos, seeking an inner peace that seems unattainable anywhere else. It's a choice that few have the courage to make. Imagine the fascination of waking up on an island where the horizon disappears from view, with no close neighbors, no traffic, and, often, no internet. To some, this sounds like a dream, a perfect retreat from society. For others, it can feel like a self-imposed prison, where silence and solitude can be suffocating. However, people who choose this life do so for deep reasons, perhaps seeking something that the modern world does not offer. Geographic isolation, then, is not just a physical barrier, but a mental border. Each isolated island has a story to tell, and many of these stories are about overcoming and adapting. The challenges are immense: the lack of resources, the adverse weather conditions, and the distance from any immediate assistance. However, those who live on these islands seem to develop a resilience that sets them apart. This strength comes from an intimate connection with the land, the ocean, and, above all, with solitude itself. It is a journey that few can fully understand, but one that awakens an undeniable curiosity in all of us. Curiosity about countries like these leads us to question: what leads someone to embrace such extreme isolation? The world's most isolated islands are more than just dots on the map. They are symbols of resistance, of an almost primitive desire to disconnect from the frenetic pace of modernity. And, as we explore these islands, we begin to understand that true isolation can be both physical and mental. And perhaps this is the greatest adventure of all. When we talk about geographic isolation, we are not just referring to the physical distance between 2 points. The isolation of these islands involves a complex web of factors: difficulty of access, distance from commercial routes, and even the absence of basic infrastructure. What characterizes an isolated island is its almost total disconnection from the rest of the world, where the arrival of a boat or plane can be a rare event. It is as if time runs at a different pace, a rhythm dictated by the forces of nature. Isolated islands, far from large cities and economic centers, live on a threshold between the known and the unknown. There is no traffic, no endless lines of cars. There is, however, a deep silence, interrupted only by the sounds of nature. Isolation, in itself, transforms the way its inhabitants see the world. Life becomes a constant struggle for survival and balance with the surrounding environment. Every decision counts, from growing food to how natural resources are used. This isolation creates a lifestyle that seems distant from modern reality. Daily routines are shaped by nature, not technology. With few visitors, the islands develop their own culture, often preserving customs and traditions that have been lost elsewhere. And yet this isolation comes at a cost. The feeling of disconnection from the rest of the world can be profound, both physically and emotionally. How does living away from everything affect those who chose these lands as home? And so, geographic isolation is not just a physical barrier, but a transformative experience. It shapes the culture, habits, and people who live there. As we explore these country facts, we begin to realize that living on an isolated island is more than just a logistical challenge. It is a way of life that requires resilience and an acceptance of loneliness. And what happens when this loneliness is shared by a small community? Somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, Pitcairn stands as a reminder of a story of rebellion and survival. This small island became a refuge for the HMS Bounty mutineers, who, in an act of desperation and freedom, sought a place where they could live far from persecution and society's norms. Today, the descendants of these rebels still live in Pitcairn, forming one of the most isolated communities in the world. Living there is like inhabiting a time capsule where history and nature mix. The story of the Bounty Rebellion is marked by courage and controversy. Fleeing military rigidity, the mutineers found Pitcairn a distant paradise, but soon realized that isolation brought with it relentless challenges. The lack of resources, the distance from any type of help, and the limited number of inhabitants are just some of the barriers that this small community still faces today. For descendants, this land is a legacy and, at the same time, a constant struggle for survival. Today, Pitcairn is an almost forgotten spot on the map. With a small population, the island depends on a few annual boats that bring supplies and some interactions with the outside world. However, the resilience of its inhabitants is evident. They learn to cultivate the land, fish, and take advantage of every natural resource available, living in a delicate balance with the environment. Life here is proof that human beings can adapt to any circumstance, even in the most extreme conditions of isolation. Curiosity about countries like Pitcairn makes us wonder, how far does the human desire for freedom and self-sufficiency go? For the inhabitants of this island, isolation is an inherited choice, a decision to honor the roots left by their ancestors. But what happens when the number of inhabitants decreases? When the world outside moves at relentless speed, Pitcairn stands as a monument to survival and the intimate connection between past and present. Lost in the vast Atlantic Ocean, Tristan da Cunha is considered the most remote inhabited island in the world. The simple idea of living in a place so far from civilization already raises questions about how its inhabitants deal with extreme isolation. Tristan is a place where nature dictates the rules, and where contact with the outside world depends on boats that make the journey just a few times a year. Still, a small community thrives on this stretch of land, surrounded by wild waters. The geographical position of Tristan da Cunha is unique. The island is more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest point, and the inhabitants have to plan their lives around the sporadic visits of ships bringing supplies and news from the rest of the world. There are no modern hospitals, nor ready access to emergency services. Any serious health problem means waiting for rescue, which can take days. However, the residents of Tristan have found a way to live in harmony with loneliness and isolation, creating a united and resilient community. Living without immediate medical assistance is one of the biggest challenges faced by the inhabitants of Tristan da Cunha. Families learn to be self-sufficient, and mutual dependence becomes essential to survive in a place where outside help does not come easily. Isolation also generates a deep connection between inhabitants who share stories, resources, and emotional support. They don't have the luxury of speed and convenience that many of us take for granted, but they make up for it with simple, meaningful lives. Tristan da Cunha challenges our modern notion of comfort and accessibility. By exploring this curiosity about such isolated countries, we begin to understand that there is a silent strength in living in a place where time seems to have stopped. Here, life is not measured by the fast pace of cities, but by the ability to face the unknown, adapt to limitations, and thrive despite distance. How do they stay connected, not physically, but spiritually, with the rest of the world? Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is one of the most enigmatic places on the planet. Located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the island is famous for its huge stone statues, the moais, which hold secrets of an ancient civilization. Living here is living with mystery daily, surrounded by monuments that defy modern understanding. Easter Island's extreme isolation has shaped both the history of its inhabitants and the way they interact with the world today. The moai, silent giants carved from volcanic stone, are Easter Island's most iconic symbol. They represent the ancestors of the Rapa Nui, but why they were built and how they were transported around the island remain a mystery to this day. However, the island's isolation also brought ecological challenges. Deforestation and lack of natural resources resulted in the collapse of the ancient civilization that flourished there. Today, residents face a new challenge: balancing tourism with preserving their culture and the environment. The ecological collapse of Easter Island is a wake-up call for the modern world. Scarcity of resources and isolation led to a crisis that nearly decimated the original population. Now, the people of Rapa Nui depend on tourism to sustain their economy, but they also fight to protect what remains of their cultural heritage. Living in such an iconic place comes with responsibilities, and preserving the Moai and the island's history is a priority for the descendants of the first inhabitants. Curiosity about countries like Easter Island reveals that isolation not only shapes everyday life, but also challenges and opportunities. The island's past offers valuable lessons about the impact of human interaction with the environment and the need to preserve endangered cultures. What can we learn from the delicate balance that the Rapa Nui try to maintain between tradition and modernity? St. Helena, a small remote island in the middle of the South Atlantic, is primarily known as the place where Napoleon Bonaparte spent his final days in exile. Its location, thousands of kilometers from Africa and South America, made it the perfect place to imprison the defeated leader, far from any possibility of rescue. Today, St. Helena remains an isolated spot on the map, where the few inhabitants live in a tranquility that seems to belong to another era. St. Helena's geographic isolation has profoundly shaped life on the island. For many years, the only way to get there or leave was via a ship that only made the route a few times a year. The recent construction of an airport has brought a new era of connectivity, but it has also generated dilemmas about how this modernity will affect the island's cultural identity. The contrast between past and present is evident. The island that was once one of the most inaccessible places in the world is now dealing with the consequences of development. St. Helena still holds memories of Napoleon's presence, and its history is an attraction for the few tourists who manage to visit the place. Walking the same trails that Napoleon walked, or visiting his last residence, offers a tangible connection to world history. However, for the inhabitants, life on the island is less about the past, and more about facing the challenges of isolation in the present. The arrival of supplies is rare, and the community relies heavily on each other to survive. Curiosity about countries like St. Helena sparks reflections on how isolation can be both a curse and a blessing. On the one hand, it protects the island from external influences and allows its history to be preserved in an authentic way. On the other, the lack of access to basic resources and services makes life a constant challenge. And in the midst of this scenario, the inhabitants continue to ask themselves, to what extent can progress coexist with the preservation of their island identity? At the end of the Southern Ocean, there is an island that many consider the most desolate and inhospitable place on the planet: Bouvet. This small piece of land covered in ice and surrounded by treacherous waters is the place where human life has no permanent place. Not a soul lives in Bouvet, and wild nature dominates unchallenged. Few expeditions have dared to challenge its freezing winds and stormy seas, making Bouvet a mystery shrouded in silence. Bouvet is technically Norwegian territory, but its remote location means it is rarely visited. The island is completely uninhabitable, with weather conditions that challenge even the most experienced explorers. One of the curiosities about countries like Norway is how they maintain sovereignty over such a distant and inaccessible place. There is no infrastructure, no way of direct communication with the outside world. Bouvet is one of the last refugees on Earth, where human presence is practically non-existent. Despite its desolation, Bouvet attracts the curiosity of scientists and explorers. Its icy waters are home to rich marine life, and the absence of humans makes it an important site for studies of climate change and pristine ecosystems. However, scientific expeditions are rare and dangerous. Most explorers trying to reach the island face the risk of shipwreck or being stranded by relentless storms. Bouvet is a reminder of the uncontrollable forces of nature. A curious country that almost no one knows about, Bouvet is a symbol of how vast and unexplored our planet still is. In a world where almost everything seems within reach, this island remains a mystery. And the question remains, what else can Bouvet's extreme isolation teach us about the resistance of nature and the fragility of human presence in such inhospitable places? Svalbard, an archipelago located in the Arctic, is one of the most extreme and remote places inhabited by humanity. With winters that plunge the land into total darkness for months and summers where the sun never sets, life on Svalbard is a true test of endurance. Those who choose to live there must not only deal with the harsh weather conditions, but also the loneliness that comes with being in one of the coldest and most isolated places in the world. It's a daily fight against nature. Survival in the Arctic requires a unique adaptation. The constant darkness in winter and incessant light in summer take their toll on both the body and the mind. The small community of Svalbard holds together, facing snowstorms and extreme cold with a combination of technology and tradition. Houses are built to withstand freezing, and people learn to live with isolation and mutual dependence. The environment is hostile, but, paradoxically, this hostility forges deep bonds between the inhabitants. Svalbard also plays a crucial role in preserving humanity's future. The famous Svalbard Global Seed Vault is located there, a vault that stores plant seeds from around the world, protecting them against global catastrophes. This adds a layer of international importance to this remote location. Even in the midst of extreme conditions, Svalbard is a symbol of hope and preservation for future generations. It's a curiosity about countries that few know about, but that have a global impact. A curious country that hides so many stories, Svalbard shows us that isolation can be both a curse and a blessing. It preserves the purity of nature and human resilience in an unforgiving environment. But what makes someone choose to live in a place where the cold can be deadly and the darkness can last for months? The answer to this question, perhaps, is deeply rooted in the human search for meaning and purpose. The Kerguelen Islands, also known as the Desolation Islands, are a group of isolated islands in the southern Indian Ocean. The name already reveals how inhospitable this place can be. There are no permanent inhabitants, and the only human presence comes from researchers and scientists who spend limited seasons studying the climate and wildlife. The landscape is marked by rocks, merciless winds, and a feeling of absolute isolation. Living here, even temporarily, is an act of pure resistance. The loneliness on the Kerguelen Islands is palpable. The incessant winds sweep across the islands, creating a landscape in constant motion, but almost devoid of human life. Only the scientists and their equipment remain, seeking to understand the mysteries of this extreme environment. Animal life, on the other hand, thrives. Seal and penguin colonies seem to ignore the harshness of the environment, while humans struggle against the elements. In Kerguelen, nature is sovereign, and survival is a constant battle. The scientific base on the Kerguelen Islands is one of the few connections with the outside world. Researchers there face daily challenges that go beyond science. Isolation, unforgiving weather, and lack of resources test physical and mental resilience. It is a place where modern technology is essential for survival, but where time seems to follow a different, slower, and more merciless rhythm. The experience of living in Kerguelen is both a scientific exploration and a personal journey for those who dare to undertake it. Curiosity about countries and territories like Kerguelen reminds us that there are still parts of the planet almost untouched by man. The wind and stone desert of these islands is a reminder of the brute force of nature, where extreme isolation defies any attempt at human domination. What else can we learn in a place where survival is a matter of constant adaptation and isolation becomes a tool for self-discovery? Living in a completely isolated place not only affects the body, but also the mind. Geographic isolation can turn into emotional isolation, and the loneliness that accompanies living in remote locations has profound impacts on mental health. Isolation syndrome is a real phenomenon that can lead to stress, depression, and even loss of track of time. Being apart from friends, family, and civilization can be challenging in ways many of us have never experienced. For those who live on these isolated islands, the feeling of disconnection from the outside world is constant. Small communities develop strong bonds among themselves, but psychological isolation is still a challenge. There is no easy escape, and modern distractions such as the internet and television can be limited or non-existent. Human beings, who are naturally social, need to find ways to deal with prolonged loneliness. People who choose this life develop strategies to keep their minds healthy, whether through hobbies, manual work, or a deep connection with nature. Mental health on isolated islands also depends on how each person deals with their own loneliness. Some communities view isolation as an opportunity for introspection and personal growth, while others struggle to maintain emotional balance. A lack of psychological support can worsen these problems, and access to mental health care is extremely limited. For many, nature and routine become a form of therapy, a way to reconnect with themselves and find peace amid isolation. Curiosity about countries and communities that live in isolation makes us reflect on what it really means to be disconnected. It's not just a question of physical distance, but of facing one's own mind in extreme conditions. How do the people who live on these islands find the strength to carry on? Perhaps the secret lies in the human capacity to adapt, to create new forms of interaction, and to find beauty even in the deepest loneliness. When looking at Socotra Island in Yemen, it's easy to imagine that you've been transported to another planet. With unique biodiversity and landscapes that look like something out of a science fiction film, Socotra is often described as the most alien place on Earth. Isolated for millions of years, the island has developed plants and animals that exist nowhere else in the world. For the few inhabitants who live there, coexistence with this exotic nature is part of the routine. The landscape of Socotra is dominated by the famous dragon's blood tree, with its bizarre shape and red sap that looks like blood. This unique flora, together with an equally peculiar fauna, makes the island a true natural laboratory. But living in such a special place brings its own challenges. Geographical isolation makes it difficult for supplies to arrive, and with tourism slowly growing, residents must balance preserving their ecosystem with economic demand. Preservation here is not only an environmental issue, but also one of cultural identity. The relationship between the inhabitants of Socotra and their alien nature is an example of adaptation and respect for the environment. With limited influence from the outside world, the local community has developed ways of living in harmony with the land. However, the growth of tourism brings a new concern: how to protect what makes Socotra such a unique place without sacrificing the economic survival of the population. This dilemma is at the heart of modern life on the island. Curiosity about a country like Socotra reminds us that, even in our globalized world, there are still places that seem untouched by time. The island's extreme isolation has turned it into a natural treasure, but also an example of how fragile coexistence between humans and nature can be. What can we learn from a place where the balance between tradition, ecosystem, and modernity is always hanging by a thread. In the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, Lampedusa is more than just a small island. She is a symbol of hope and despair. For thousands of refugees crossing the Mediterranean in search of a better life, Lampedusa is their first point of contact with Europe. The island, which is part of Italy, has become a humanitarian battlefield, where the dilemmas of immigration, reception, and survival are mixed into a complex reality. Living there means facing a global crisis in a deeply personal and everyday way. The inhabitants of Lampedusa, despite being isolated from the European continent, are on the front line of one of the biggest humanitarian crises today. Boats full of desperate people reach its shores with alarming frequency. For residents, the island's geographic isolation is both a blessing and a curse. They are far from the urban frenzy, but isolation does not protect them from the human drama unfolding before their eyes. Each new boat brings a story of suffering, loss, and hope. The humanitarian dilemma facing Lampedusa is a heavy burden for such a small community. The island has limited resources, and emergency services are often insufficient to deal with the growing number of refugees. However, the solidarity of the inhabitants is palpable. They offer shelter, food, and assistance, even though they know the logistical and emotional challenges are immense. Lampedusa's resilience in the face of a global crisis is a powerful example of how humanity can flourish in even the most isolated places. Curiosity about countries and islands like Lampedusa reveals that isolation does not necessarily protect against major global issues. On the contrary, in some cases, it further exposes weaknesses and the need for compassion. While the world debates solutions to the migration crisis, the inhabitants of this small island continue to live at the intersection between two worlds, that of people arriving in search of safety and that of the limitations of living in such a remote place. Palmerston Island in the Cook Islands is a fascinating example of how life can thrive in total isolation. With a population of just a few dozen people, all inhabitants are descendants of a single man, William Marsters, who arrived on the island in the 19th century. Palmerston is a self-sufficient and harmonious community, where people live according to a simple, well-defined routine. But does extreme isolation, combined with a small population, really create a perfect community? Life in Palmerston is governed by tradition and mutual cooperation. There are no markets, shops, or hospitals, and everything the community needs must be grown, fished, or brought in by boats that arrive only a few times a year. Each family plays an essential role in maintaining the island, from fishing to building their homes. Isolation has brought them together in a way few other communities in the world experience, and self-reliance is a matter of survival, not choice. However, living in such a small community has its challenges. With few people and even fewer resources, dependence among inhabitants is immense. Any disruption to the delicate balance they have created could result in serious problems. Furthermore, contact with the outside world is minimal, which means that any crisis on the island may take time to resolve. However, Palmerstonians are resilient and demonstrate an extraordinary ability to adapt to the isolated environment in which they live. Curiosity about countries and communities like Palmerston makes us reflect on what it really means to live in harmony with nature and others. Would it be possible to live in a society that does not depend on technology or the frenetic pace of modernity? Or does isolation create its own difficulties, invisible to those looking from the outside? Palmerston is a living experiment in how a small community can survive, but can it thrive indefinitely? Imagine living in a place where sunlight is your only source of lighting, and the wind and waves dictate the rhythm of your routine. For many remote islanders, this is everyday reality. The lack of electricity on many of these islands means they rely on natural resources to meet their basic needs. living without electricity completely transforms the way people interact with the world around them, forcing them to return to their origins, where nature dictates the rules. Some islands have adopted sustainable solutions to overcome electricity shortages. The use of solar panels and wind generators has become common in places where connection to electrical grids is impossible. These technologies offer a more modern way of life, but still very limited compared to what we are used to. Cooking, storing food, and even communicating with the outside world become daily challenges. For many, this is a life of extreme simplicity, where the basics become an achievement. The absence of electricity also profoundly impacts the way people socialize. Without the distraction of electronic devices, time is spent in conversations, manual activities, and maintaining community. Night falls early, and candles and lanterns become the lights of the home. This creates a more intimate connection between inhabitants who depend on each other to keep life moving. For those accustomed to the comfort and convenience of electricity, this reality may seem almost unimaginable. Curiosity about countries and islands without electricity makes us wonder, what would we lose if we didn't have the modern facilities that we consider essential? More than a technological setback, living without electricity forces a reconnection with simplicity, a life closer to what really matters. But what happens when progress knocks on the doors of these islands? How to balance preserving a simple lifestyle with the advantages of modernity? In recent years, tourism has found its way to the most remote islands on the planet. The desire to escape the frenzy of big cities and experience nature in its purest form is attracting visitors in search of unusual adventures. For many of these islands, tourism provides a vital source of income, but it also brings unexpected challenges. Living in a place that was once isolated and unknown suddenly turns into a constant struggle to balance tradition and modernity. The environmental impact of tourism on isolated islands is a growing concern. These fragile lands, often untouched for centuries, face the risk of degradation due to increasing numbers of visitors. The island's limited resources are tested to the maximum, and local infrastructure is often not prepared to handle large influxes of people. The challenge for the inhabitants is clear: how to profit from tourism without destroying what makes their islands unique and attractive. Despite the risks, many inhabitants of isolated islands see tourism as an opportunity to improve their lives. New businesses are emerging, offering rustic accommodations, eco-tours, and authentic experiences that connect tourists to local life. However, this new dynamic can also distance residents from their roots. Tourism brings with it external influences that can dilute the culture and customs that made these islands so special. Curiosity about countries facing this rise in tourism in isolated areas makes us reflect. To what extent is it possible to preserve the authenticity of a place when it opens up to the world? Finding a balance between preserving identity and attracting visitors is a delicate dance, and the future of these islands may depend on how their communities deal with the influx of foreigners. How can we find this balance before tourism itself compromises the essence it seeks to explore? In a world where connectivity is a daily necessity, living on an isolated island means dealing with fragile communications. The internet, which for many of us is a constant, can be intermittent or even non-existent on some of these islands. Dependence on radios, letters, and other traditional means of communication is still the reality for many inhabitants. Living without the certainty that you can communicate with the outside world at any time is an experience that few of us can imagine, but for these communities, it is just another everyday challenge. The arrival of the internet on some of these islands was celebrated as a revolution, connecting them to the rest of the world in an unprecedented way. However, this connection is fragile. Submarine cables that can be damaged by storms, equipment that fails, and dependence on satellites make the internet unstable. When modern communication fails, residents must resort to ancient ways of staying in touch, such as shortwave radios and even letters that can take weeks or months to reach their destination. This digital isolation profoundly affects the way people live their lives. Disconnecting from the constant flow of information and social media offers, on the one hand, a break from the stress of modern life, but on the other, it limits opportunities for education, remote work, and economic development. For many young people on these islands, the lack of connectivity is a factor driving migration to larger cities, in search of a more connected and promising future. Curiosity about countries that face these communication challenges reveals a different reality than the one many of us live in. The lack of connectivity may seem like a limitation, but it also offers a freedom that few experience. The freedom to be present in the moment, to live in tune with the environment around us. Still, the future of these islands may depend on improving these communications, raising the dilemma: how to embrace progress without losing the essence of isolation. Niue, a small island in the South Pacific, holds the title of one of the most isolated nations in the world. With a population of just over 1,000 people, the island faces the constant challenge of maintaining its traditions and identity, while fighting against the flight of its inhabitants to more connected and economically viable lands. Niue's geographic solitude, while protecting its culture, also threatens its long-term survival. What keeps this small nation going is the pride of its people and their incredible resilience. Life on Niue is deeply connected to the land and sea. Self-sufficiency is a necessity, as trade with other nations is rare and complicated by distance. Residents fish, farm, and maintain a lifestyle that has remained relatively unchanged for generations. However, modernity begins to infiltrate, bringing with it the desire for opportunities that do not exist on the small island. For many young people, the only option is to leave their homeland and seek a better life in larger, more developed countries. Resident flight is a serious issue for Niue. As young people leave, the island slowly empties and preserving its culture becomes an increasing challenge. However, the local government and remaining inhabitants are determined to keep the essence of Niue alive. Sustainable tourism projects and cultural initiatives seek to attract visitors and highlight the uniqueness of this small nation. Niue is not just a curiosity about isolated countries. It is a nation fighting to preserve its place in the world. A curious country facing the threat of disappearance, Niue teaches us that isolation can be both a shield and a double-edged sword. Their survival depends on a delicate balance between opening themselves up to the world and keeping their roots deeply connected to the land that sustains them. But what happens when the number of inhabitants continues to decline? How can the smallest nation in the world ensure its continuity in a world that is becoming increasingly globalized? On the most isolated islands in the world, education takes on a very different form than what we are used to. Limited access to teachers and resources means that many children grow up learning at home or in schools with very basic facilities. In these communities, distance learning is a common solution, but a lack of internet or reliable electricity can make learning difficult. For these children, school is not just a place to acquire knowledge. It is also a rare connection point with the outside world. The lack of qualified teachers is a constant problem on isolated islands. Teachers often come from abroad and only stay for short periods, leaving gaps in the continuity of learning. To compensate, parents and the local community often take on the role of educators, imparting practical knowledge that is vital for survival on the island, such as fishing, agriculture, and respect for nature. Still, the absence of a formal curriculum can limit future opportunities for young people who want to explore beyond their island borders. The impact of globalization is also felt in education on these islands. With the introduction of modern technologies and teaching methods, there is a constant tension between preserving local traditions and preparing young people for a globalized world. Distance education projects, funded by international organizations, have attempted to close this gap, but the success of these programs varies greatly depending on island conditions. For many, the future of education on the remote islands is uncertain, but the determination to provide opportunities for children remains firm. Curiosity about countries where education is so challenging reveals that despite the limitations, these islands produce resilient individuals capable of adapting to any situation. Learning here goes beyond the classroom and extends to the sea, the land, the community. But to what extent can educational isolation be sustainable? And how will the next generations of these islands face the challenges of a world that is constantly changing? Living on an isolated island has its charms, but it also poses a big question. What happens when an emergency arises? In big cities, help is minutes away, but on remote islands, any kind of medical assistance or rescue can take days, if not weeks. When the unexpected occurs in a distant place, the local community is forced to face the situation with the limited resources they have. This isolation creates an atmosphere of self-sufficiency, where people learn to care for each other, but it also exposes the fragility of relying on outside help. Stories of dramatic rescues and emergency medical flights are not uncommon on isolated islands. Helicopters or boats often have to brave storms to reach someone in need. In some cases, residents are forced to improvise and treat injuries or illnesses with the few medical resources available. Isolation turns every emergency into a race against time, where patience and resilience are tested to the limit. Still, these communities find ways to survive, adapting to the reality that help will not always come quickly. The inhabitants of these islands also develop a deep understanding of the body and health. They learn to recognize danger signs early, avoid accidents that could be fatal, and take preventive measures to avoid larger emergencies. Without nearby hospitals or specialized doctors, the population becomes highly aware of their health and their physical limits. On many islands, ancient knowledge of medicinal plants and natural cures plays a crucial role in daily care. Curiosity about remote countries and islands shows that isolation can be both a blessing and a curse. The absence of immediate relief creates a deeper connection between inhabitants and their land, but it also places them in a vulnerable position. The question remains, to what extent can these communities maintain this self-sufficiency when the world around them is so connected and dependent on modern technologies and infrastructure? The world's remote islands are on the front lines of climate change. Rising sea levels, more frequent and intense storms, and coastal erosion are turning these isolated lands into increasingly vulnerable places. For communities living in these places, geographic isolation, which once offered some protection from the outside world, now becomes a barrier to escaping the devastating effects of climate. Living on a remote island was already a challenge in itself, but with climate change, survival becomes even more difficult. Rising sea levels are one of the biggest threats to many of these islands. Lands that were once safe are now slowly disappearing, forcing inhabitants to reconsider their options. Migration becomes an inevitable reality for some islands, where the population is forced to abandon their homes and seek refuge in other lands. Forced displacement due to climate issues is a new form of exile, where island culture and identity are threatened with extinction along with the eroding soil. In addition to the physical impact, climate change also affects the economy of these islands. Many communities depend on fishing and agriculture to survive, but with changing weather patterns, natural cycles that were once predictable now become uncertain. Destructive storms and prolonged droughts reduce agricultural production and fish stocks, leaving local populations in a position of extreme vulnerability. What was once a life in balance with nature now becomes a constant struggle to adapt to a changing environment. Curiosity about countries and islands affected by climate change makes us reflect on the resilience of these communities. They are on the front lines of a global problem, but their voices often go unheard. What these islands teach us is that climate change is not a distant issue, but a present and urgent reality. How can these small communities continue to fight for their survival, while the world around them debates solutions that often come too late? Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean, is much more than just an isolated piece of land. It bears scars from one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War, becoming a symbol of courage and sacrifice. Despite its small size, Iwo Jima was the scene of a colossal fight between the United States and Japan. A battle that left a profound legacy both for the soldiers who fought there and for future generations. Today, the island is largely uninhabited, but its past still echoes in the beaches and dark caves that once served as shelter. Iwo Jima's geographic isolation made it a strategic point during the war, but also contributed to its oblivion after the conflict. Now, few visit the site, except for veterans and historians looking to better understand the sacrifice made by so many on that soil. For many, walking the island's black sands is an almost spiritual experience, an opportunity to reconnect with a pivotal moment in world history. However, the harsh environment and isolation continue to keep Iwo Jima a place of memory. The island, however, is not just about war. Beneath its surface, nature has been trying to recover what was lost. The desolate beaches, where soldiers once fought for survival, are now home to birds and resilient flora that have adapted to the volcanic climate and isolation. Iwo Jima, with its caves and arid landscape, has become a silent monument, a place where past and present meet in an atmosphere of respect and reflection. Curiosity about countries that are home to territories like Iwo Jima reveals that even the most remote and forgotten islands can hold powerful stories. They remind us that isolation does not always mean oblivion, but rather an opportunity to preserve memory. What can we learn from an island where silence echoes with the weight of history? Clipperton, a small island in the Pacific Ocean, has a history that few know, but which is marked by tragedy and despair. This piece of land, surrounded by coral reefs, was the scene of one of the darkest episodes of human isolation. In the early 20th century, a small Mexican garrison was sent to Clipperton, along with their families, to establish a colony and claim sovereignty over the island. However, what began as a nationalist mission soon turned into a desperate fight for survival. With the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, the garrison was forgotten. Promises of supplies and reinforcements never arrived, and the inhabitants of Clipperton were left to fend for themselves. The extreme isolation of the island meant that, over time, food and drinking water were depleted. The situation quickly deteriorated, and the garrison faced hunger, disease, and a lack of hope. What was supposed to be a symbol of Mexican sovereignty ended up becoming a place of despair and death. Clipperton's stories reveal the devastating psychological impact of isolation. Over time, discipline among the soldiers broke down, and abuses began to surface, leading to a complete collapse of the social order on the island. When they were finally rescued, few survivors remained, and the Clipperton tragedy has gone down in history as one of the most horrific examples of abandonment in extreme isolation. The island was left uninhabited as a grim reminder of its history. Curiosity about countries and territories like Clipperton reminds us that isolation is not just a matter of geography, but also of human abandonment. The island's tragedy echoes as a warning about the dangers of leaving isolated populations without support. How can Clipperton's lessons help us better understand the challenges of living in such a distant place, where survival may depend on decisions made thousands of miles away? On the world's most isolated islands, wildlife flourishes in ways that often defy the imagination. Animals and plants have adapted to the extreme conditions of isolation, creating unique and fascinating ecosystems. For the inhabitants of these islands, coexistence with this wild fauna and flora is part of everyday life. But this relationship is not without challenges. Harmony between humans and nature in such remote places requires respect, observation, and constant adaptation to the laws of nature, which can be both generous and ruthless. On many of these islands, we find species that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Isolated evolution allowed animals and plants to develop unique characteristics, which transforms these places into true biodiversity laboratories. Take, for example, Socotra Island, with its dragon's blood tree, or the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands. Each species carries with it a history of survival that goes back thousands or even millions of years. For locals, these animals are not just curiosities, but an integral part of their way of life and culture. Learning to coexist with them is a daily lesson in respect for nature. However, this coexistence is not always peaceful. On some islands, the presence of wild animals represents a real challenge for residents. Animals that attack crops, destroy homes, or pose a direct physical threat need to be respected, but also controlled in a balanced way. On the Svalbard Islands, for example, where the presence of polar bears is constant, inhabitants and visitors need to always be prepared for encounters with these predators. It is a situation in which human beings, no matter how technological, need to accept their vulnerability to the forces of nature. Human presence also has a significant impact on the wildlife of these islands. The balance between human development and the preservation of ecosystems is a delicate issue. The introduction of invasive species by colonizers or tourists, deforestation, and the exploitation of natural resources are constant threats to the wildlife that thrive in these unique environments. Curiosity about countries and islands like these leads us to think, can we learn to live with nature without destroying it? And what do these islands teach us about the urgent need to protect the natural world, which, over time, is always the most resilient but also the most fragile in the face of human interference? Having a private island is one of the greatest symbols of power and exclusivity in the modern imagination. But while the idea of owning an island paradise may sound like the height of freedom and luxury, the reality of living in complete voluntary isolation can be quite different. On the world's most remote private islands, where access to resources and even communication is limited, a dream can easily turn into a nightmare. Self-sufficiency is not just an option, but a necessity, and the responsibility of keeping an island running goes far beyond having a beautiful view. Those who have the privilege of owning a private island know that extreme isolation brings its own set of unique challenges. Owning an island may seem like a refuge from the stress of the modern world, but maintaining basic infrastructure is a constant burden. Without regular electricity or easy access to clean water, homeowners are forced to invest in self-sustainable solutions like solar panels and desalination plants. Every little detail, from food transportation to waste management, needs to be thought out and planned in advance, and any unforeseen event can be disastrous. On the other hand, the isolation of these islands can provide a level of peace and tranquility unattainable anywhere else on the planet. Here, far from any other soul, the sounds of nature are the only constant companion. However, that same loneliness can become oppressive. A lack of social interaction and prolonged isolation can bring to the surface deep emotional issues, such as a fear of loneliness or a feeling of disconnection from the rest of the world. Many island owners discover that, despite the luxury, living completely isolated requires a mental and emotional resilience that few are prepared to face. Furthermore, there is an ethical and environmental issue at stake. Curiosity about remote countries and islands often reveals that these lands, when exploited for private purposes, are at risk of suffering serious environmental impacts. The introduction of technologies and the increase in the human footprint can harm fragile ecosystems that for thousands of years have remained untouched. Island ownership is ultimately a delicate balance between enjoying luxury and respecting the forces of nature that have shaped these pieces of land over the centuries. And the big question that remains is, to what extent can voluntary isolation really be the solution to escape modern chaos without compromising what makes these islands such a rare natural refuge? In many parts of the world, the impact of climate change and rising sea levels is already a reality that directly threatens the existence of several islands. What was once considered a distant phenomenon has now become an urgent issue for countless island communities who face the imminent loss of their land. Islands that for centuries served as homes for entire populations are now on the verge of completely disappearing beneath the waters, leaving their inhabitants with no choice but to abandon what they have always known as home. The feeling of loss is immeasurable, not just for the physical land, but for the culture and history that these islands carry. The case of the Maldives is perhaps the best-known example of this silent tragedy. This paradisiacal archipelago in the Indian Ocean, famous for its white sand beaches and crystal-clear waters, is facing the real threat of being swallowed by the sea. Forecasts indicate that, in the coming decades, a large part of the Maldives' territory could disappear, forcing its inhabitants to become climate refugees. For many, this idea of being forced to leave their homeland by something as impersonal as rising sea levels is devastating. A people's identity and history are deeply rooted in their land, and losing that means much more than just changing address. In addition to the Maldives, other islands such as Tuvalu and Kiribati are also facing the same fate. Coastal erosion, combined with increasingly intense storms, is making these islands uninhabitable. In some cases, islands are literally shrinking, and communities are forced to move inland, where space is limited and resources are scarce. What is lost in this is not just the physical land, but also a traditional way of life that is closely linked to the island environment. Fishing, coastal agriculture, and other centuries-old customs are being destroyed by the relentless advance of the sea. Curiosity about countries and islands at risk of disappearing brings a deep reflection on the fragility of our planet. These islands are the canaries in the climate change coal mine, warning us of what is to come. While the rest of the world debates solutions to combat global warming, the populations of these islands are already facing the direct consequences. How can we help preserve not just the land, but the culture and dignity of these people? What is at stake is not just a question of geography, but of humanity, where each island that disappears reminds us of what we all have to lose if we don't act now. The world's isolated islands are often seen as relics of a distant past, where time seems to have stood still and modernity has barely scratched its surface. However, as the world advances, these islands face an increasingly urgent dilemma. Is it possible to continue living in isolation on a planet that becomes increasingly connected? For many of these communities, isolation has always been a way of life, but new technologies and external pressures are challenging their ability to remain self-sufficient and true to their traditions. The arrival of new technologies, such as satellite internet and renewable energy, has brought both benefits and challenges to these islands. On the one hand, they offer the possibility of improving living conditions, facilitating access to education, health, and communication with the outside world. However, these same technologies also threaten to disintegrate the cultural fabric of these communities. As the digital world penetrates these previously untouched lands, The delicate balance between tradition and progress becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. How to reconcile modernity with the desire to preserve a way of life that is unique and valuable? Another factor complicating the future of these islands is migration. Many young people are leaving their homelands in search of opportunities in larger cities, where the promise of education, jobs, and a more connected life is irresistible. As a result, island populations are shrinking, leaving behind increasingly aging and dependent communities. The question that arises is, how long will these islands be able to sustain their small populations and maintain their traditions? The constant exodus of young people threatens the continuity of these cultures, which depend on future generations to survive. Curiosity about countries and islands facing these dilemmas shows us that the future of these isolated lands is at an inflection point. Change is coming, whether residents want it or not, and it is up to these communities to decide how to navigate these transformations without losing what makes them unique. What these islands teach us is that progress, no matter how beneficial it may seem, always demands a price. The question is, how far can we advance without sacrificing what we value most in our identity and way of life? Living on an isolated island is much more than just a geographic choice. It is a life choice that carries deep meanings. Isolation, for many, is a form of freedom, where intimate connection with nature replaces the noise and rush of the modern world. On these islands, time moves differently, and life takes on a simpler, more contemplative rhythm. However, this choice also comes with sacrifices, and few are willing to give up the conveniences of modernity for an existence that, although serene, is full of challenges and uncertainties. Geographic isolation, while attractive in many ways, also tests the limits of human resilience. The absence of immediate assistance, the lack of infrastructure, and the constant dependence on natural resources force the inhabitants of these islands to constantly adapt. In a world where digital connectivity is present almost everywhere, these islands remain refugees for a more authentic but also more fragile life. Living in isolation, deep down, is a lesson in self-sufficiency and the ability to find balance in the midst of loneliness. These islands teach us that isolation is not just a physical issue, but also an emotional and psychological issue. For those who choose to live far from the world, isolation can bring both peace and profound mental challenges. Connection with the environment, with the few inhabitants, and with one's own mind becomes essential. Life in isolation requires a special kind of strength, one that comes from accepting that in many ways we are governed by the forces of nature and our ability to adapt to them. Curiosity about countries and islands that still live in isolation offers us a unique perspective on what it means to live a life in balance with nature. As the rest of the world races toward the future, these islands stand as reminders that sometimes the true value of life lies in its simplicity. What else can we learn by looking at these communities, which, despite their distance, teach us so much about resilience, community, and the deep meaning of being at peace with oneself?
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop, we're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.